And we're live.
I'm glad we're live, Henrik.
It's finally happening, Gar.
I've only
It's
had to wait a
huge.
year.
Only needed to wait a year for this. It's great to finally have you on the show. How does it feel to be a part of the 10th episode of Behind the Future?
It feels like it's on to the next stage of it. Once you get to double figures, the podcast is real. Up until then, you're experimenting with
Yes.
it.
The
That's been my
magic is
observation with
real.
podcasts. Yeah, the
Yeah,
magic is real. Henrik,
the
bring the
magic
magic.
is real. I just have to say this, I already celebrated today. I ate a waffle earlier today, and it was one of the best waffles that I ever had. So I just had to say that because it was very good. Yeah.
Uh, And we've been talking about these waffles, and I'm not a big waffle fan, but I think I've got Belgian waffles in mind, and apparently
Yes.
Norwegian waffles, which are heart shaped, which is
Yes.
interesting. Yeah, and I also got introduced to brown cheese, which also doesn't sound amazing,
Good.
and those two
Yeah.
together. So the challenge has been extended for brown cheese and waffles, and I went, okay, yeah, let's do it. So we'll
There's
figure it out at some point.
yeah, it's definitely two things I can recommend. The Norwegian waffles, they speak for themselves. But of course, for the ones that are tuning in, we're not going to talk about waffles today. We talked a little bit about waffles, but what we're going to talk about today is actually we're going to talk about how to manage and navigate change in larger organizations. And we've been talking about this for a long time, that enterprise architecture, if you will, is one of the many topics. But we see, especially through the pandemic, that more and more organizations are seeing the importance and also the need for having a proper governance in place, and how they actually go about managing change in their organizations. And that's why we also wanted to create this series, which is called Behind the Future, where we sit down with IT professionals to learn about how they're actually managing change in their organizations. So the previous episode was actually in the US with my colleague, and I like to call him the Hollywood actor, Griffin, where he talked to kind of about what are the current state of enterprise architecture. But today, we're going to learn more about Gar as well, his experience in IT, and then also how to manage change in one of the biggest healthcare systems in the world. So, again, Gar, it's great to have you on the show. And what I want to say and kind of start with as well is, how did it all start with you? Like, what type of ambitions did you have when you were growing up? What did you want to become?
Professional basketball player. That was it. So
Hmm.
up until the age of 18, until reality dawned that I wasn't tall enough or fast enough and kind of prone to injury at that point. Up until
Yeah,
that point, that was the only focus in town. It was playing sport, and the
yeah.
rest of it would figure itself out. And luckily, that's kind of worked. But that was kind of the original ambition. And then
Hmm.
I guess a drifting through. So I did business in college. Like I didn't do anything to do with technology, and this was back in the 90s, which is you were but a child at that point, Henrik. I think.
Correct.
Um, yeah, correct. As was I. But at that point in time, this is before the dot com boom. All of a sudden, we needed lots of people to go into the industry. So there were these conversion courses emerged. So I did a conversion course into it was a graduate diploma in information technology, and everything made sense. So I got
Hmm.
computers. Computers got me. We could do stuff, and it was good. But it was like 1 year, and then at the end of that, I ended up working in a consulting organization. So I actually my first job in technology was I worked for Bill Gates, but it wasn't the real Bill Gates. Although he would get phone calls from investors all the time, or from startups going like, "I want you to invest in it." And this guy like had a small tech shop in Colorado, and it was
Yeah.
building websites for people. Back when building websites was the thing to do, and people would pay you
Yeah.
for it. You didn't have Squarespace, and you couldn't build it yourself.
No.
So it started there, and then I ended up in Capgemini. Was kind of my first real job, and then you kind of get thrown into things. So it was before the euro existed, and I know so it's there was we had punts and everybody else had different currencies, and we had to do this big conversion project for the post office in Ireland. So that was kind of
Mhm.
my first foray into anything to do with technology in a real way. And
Mhm.
so actually for the first part of my career, I was software developer, and that's kind of where I started. And then
Yeah.
I by accident it was one of those strange ones that I was living in Australia back in '99, and the company I was working for an insurance company, and the market was so buoyant, so there was high churn, and so the architect left, and the guy who was running it said, "You're the architect," and I went, "What the hell does an architect
Yeah.
do?" So I've spent the past 23 years trying to figure that out. like what an architect does, what they could do, what they shouldn't do, what they do,
Mm.
how they work, the techniques they use, the way we approach change. So all of those things have kind of been part and parcel of it. So that's been an
Yeah.
ongoing expedition.
And how was kind of the role of an architect looked upon back in the 90s?
This was very much, and I think I've been every flavor of architect. So I've been a software architect, a solution architect, a business architect. I was the first digital architect I could find. So when digital became a thing, when Gartner decided we were all going to go digital, I looked on LinkedIn because I was kind of tired of I experimented with my title on LinkedIn just to play. And so I changed it to digital architect, and I was the only one I could find at that time. I've since abandoned that because it's the titles in some way are meaningless. And I think back then, really what people were talking about were kind of senior engineers, and the architect title kind of got co-opted and brought in sideways. And I mean, to be honest, the industry has been very confused between what's engineering, what's architecture, all the way through, and the things that an architect does versus the things an engineer does, and the distance to technology. So how far away are you from it? How close are you to it? And particularly as you get into business architecture and things like that, or we get then these confusions as product companies come out and go, we've got a product X architect. It was like,
Mm.
really? Or we've got so I've seen UX architect recently. It was like a UX architect. So that, which
Mm.
is, I mean, to me, like we've had information architecture and user experience design. There's elements of that are to do with information architecture. There's elements that are to do with business architecture. But we keep reinventing these things and applying these labels to people, but without really clarifying what skills they need or what the job looks
Mm.
like or what the role is.
Yeah.
Like what's your purpose? What are you trying to do? And that's,
Mhm.
I think that's an ongoing problem.
Yeah. And then like 20 years later as well, like from the first architect role. So how do you look at kind of architecture today? And that's is a very difficult, question to answer as well. But every company is a digital company in 2022. So how do you see kind of the architect role in an organization or in a company today?
So I guess if you're trying to figure out how to, well, I guess let's divide it in two, right? The companies that grew up kind of pre-internet and the companies that grew up kind of on the internet, kind of that way. If you grew up on the internet, it's kind of part of your DNA, and you think about it
Mm.
differently, and the way you grew up and the way you organize is different in some cases, not in all cases. But the pre-internet companies, so if you've been around for 30 years, 20 years even, then and it's not in your DNA and you didn't think about it this way, then we've gone through cycle after cycle of let's go for the core. We're going to digitize the core. We're going to build a platform. We're going to do these kind of things. And we keep trying all of these things, either like throwing technology at a problem or saying,
Mm.
actually, technology doesn't matter. All right. So then we go through that dance of technology doesn't matter, or let's make it somebody else's problem to do it. Or SaaS comes along and so, oh, well, everything is going to be SaaS. It was like, okay, that's great. The core of it is you still have to understand the business that you're in and what you do. And that's kind of the fundamental to it. And then what an architect can bring is a different lens to it to say, if we were going to do this differently and apply digital technologies to this, how do we get some value from it that's actually going to have a material impact to the organization I'm in, be it a commercial organization, a government, not for profit? It doesn't really matter. Where's the value coming from? Where does the value flow to? So to me, the architect role is really, it's trying to figure out how do we get value from our technology investments, and
Yeah.
whatever it takes to do that. And I'm like, the problem I think that we have is we tend to limit, and we also tend to draw boundaries where we should be connecting. So we say, this is
Mhm.
my bit, so I look after this, as opposed to seeing it as a team sport where we've all got to kind of work together to move the ball down the field. And we don't do it a lot. So we end up with these kind of tribal debates between us and some other group within an organization, or we've siloed technology off into its own thing and say, well, IT are the guys over there.
Yep.
And there's kind of a maturity. You see it at different levels in different organizations. I'm sure you guys see it all the time. Like you go to an organization at like a certain level of maturity, they don't understand. The architects are kind of fixed, and some of them, like I mean, I've worked. Like one of the things I did along the way was I founded a chapter of ISA, which is a professional association for architects in Ireland. So it was a start in the US. Paul Price is the CEO, is now based in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
And we were trying to figure out like what architects would do and where they play and what skills they need to have and how we accredit them. And what you find is that people became fixated with frameworks. It was like, we need frameworks and we need methods and you've got to come and do
Exactly.
our thing. It was like, oh. And the more you thought about it, and if you apply the lens of who's your customer, right? So if you're an architect, who's your customer? And if you're not asking who's your customer, then and you're expecting people to just show up just because it's a good thing to do, because
Mm.
standards and policy and governance and frameworks are important. They're only important if they're delivering value in some way. And
Exactly.
that's so we've kind of gone. We go through this and we kind of we. It's funny because if you take outside of architecture, if you look at agile has gone through this bit of it was kind of light, useful, pragmatic, and now it's gone to complex, heavyweight, complicated. Like it's really messy, heavy, and we just go through this dance as we go backwards and forwards through it. And I think one of the interesting things over 20 years is that you see this. And it was funny. I was talking to a guy who's been like 40 years. He's been in the industry for 40, I think nearly 50 years. And he said,
Mm.
like, I've seen the same thing happen 7 times. And so we do this dance and go back and forward and go
Yeah.
back and forward. And I don't think we've settled on how we do it. I think we're getting closer in some ways. And all we do is we identify a bottleneck or something new comes along. We're constantly looking for silver bullets. And
Yeah.
I think that's and the industry itself is kind of designed around that. It's designed to hype the latest thing. And I think one of the things that I've always kind of counseled architects on is that we're like a hype suppression system, right? So when
Yeah.
the hype comes along and everybody gets excited, it's not to pour cold water on it, but it's to temper it with like kind of temper it with reality. Like
Yeah.
what's actually possible right now versus like this nirvana, this dream of like what people are selling you, often unachievable from where you are right now. And I think that's
Exactly.
the big lesson is you got to start where you
Exactly.
are.
Yeah, and this and kind of and you mentioned this as well, but like we have said it several times before, but like the frameworks, the notations, the method, working with your architecture, like it's a vehicle for transition. It's not the end goal. And this is, I think,
Mm.
it's funny. Every single conversation that we have is don't get too rigid with one framework, because that's just going to help you hit the ground running. But you also need to look at that in the lens with your own kind of business and your own customers. Like, who are you delivering services to, even if it's like public or if it's private sector? But they seem to forget that this is just to enable that transformation and kind of improve the organization or improve the business. And one thing that I want to mention as well is that we see this more and more, and more, is that you have CIOs, CTOs that are starting to invest heavily in their enterprise architecture capabilities, but you also see there's a lot of organizations that where they have people in the C-level management that have kind of lost value in the architecture capability. So I know that as health service executive, you guys have a very good relationship to the CIO office, to the executive stakeholders as well. And kind of just quickly, how can you build that relationship with C-level and show them that there's a reason why kind of the architecture function exists, and this is the value that we're
Yeah.
going to deliver.
So I guess just to clarify that, so I work as a digital advisor working for the CIO. So I kind of have so it's I'm not formally an architect within the structure, so within the agency structure, but all
Yeah.
of my experience and my training is in that. And I think like one of the things that I think has been challenging for architects, and it's not, so this isn't exclusive to the HSE, it's kind of like it's a cross industry thing, is that architects became removed from value. Like, so we kind of pulled further and further away, and it became more about the formality, the standards, the policies, the principles, things like that. And all of these things, just to go back to what you were saying about just the languages and notations, all of those efforts, so everything that people, so if you look at like Archimate, if you look at what Mark was trying to do, if you look at all of those kind of things, they were trying to improve the quality of the conversation, improve the quality of the thinking around it. But it had to be your thinking. And if this was a language that you were learning new and you didn't know it, then there's an introductory piece. You can't go from like speaking, like I was trying my Norwegian pronunciation this morning, and if I can't pronounce brunust in or how
I think it was good.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I'm chancing my arm there. But if you can't do those things and express yourself clearly, then we just end up with this mismatch, right? So we end up with this problem of a mismatch. And really, one of the things that we're trying to do across the board with relation to change in an organization is just change the quality of the conversation. So if we get better quality conversations, then we can do it. So that's at one level. Now we get better understanding. So I had like some of the work that I've been doing both independently with ISA and kind of with other groups was like, how do we build these tools that are like artifacts of shared understanding, right? So because a lot of the stuff that an architect would do is kind of, it's stuff for me, and stuff for me as an architect, and it's my work product, but it's not useful to you, right? Or it's not the bits where we touch off each other. So what I'm really interested in is the bits where we touch off each other, where it's a shared understanding of a concept or a thing. And I think a lot of the work that's been done in design thinking and service design and those and UX, it has all been around trying to bring those up. But then when you tie those kind of constructs into some of the formal languages that we've got, then you get real power, because then I can tie it into a model that I can begin to manage over time. Because a
Mm.
lot of times, a lot of the design thinking exercises end up as just yellow snow on the floor at the end of a workshop where the post-its fall from the wall and that's it. We all had a great
Mhm.
time. This is amazing. And then we move on.
Yeah.
So I think at one level, quality conversation is incredibly important, and actually understanding the language of the organization that you live in, whatever. And I've worked in insurance, in banking, in pharma, I think I pretty much touched everything, right?
Hmm.
Not everything, but I've worked in manufacturing. I've worked in lots of different organizations and in different, like in, I should go back in terms of just an explanation of this. So I did I was involved in a consortium called the Innovation Value Institute, which is doing assessments in organizations. So as part of that, we would go in and do assessments either on architecture, or it could be on overall strategy, or kind of value from technology investments.
Yeah.
And so we would dive deep into kind of big pharma companies or big banks or big oil companies, and you'd spend months trying to figure out what made this thing tick. And a lot of the times it's the same pattern, it's the same pathology that you see, and it's the same things that limit our ability to really elevate the conversation and become relevant to the organization. Because
Mhm.
we're looking at the wrong thing. We're looking at something that the organization doesn't understand it should care about, and we're not articulating that properly. So I think that's at one level. At the other level is you got to deliver something. And architects that aren't delivering something of value, there's no point, right? So I think
Mhm.
I think that's the shift that we need to, that like as in it, well, as a let's call it a profession, like broadly from an architecture perspective, we've got to just jump in there and demonstrate that we can actually deliver things.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things in the last couple of years with COVID has been our ability to deliver at pace, right? Things that
Mhm.
were seemed impossible beforehand, and you're looking at it going, so what changed? And really, the change was that the urgency was there. So if you go
Mhm.
back to like Cotter's 8-step model for change, the first step was, is there urgency? And
Yeah.
with a pandemic, so we've urgency, right? So it kicks in straight away, and everybody's firing.
Exactly.
I think at
There
that
is
point,
a
the leash comes off, and you can
yeah.
work, you can do the good work.
Mhm. Yeah, there was definitely a burning platform through the pandemic as well, and of course, and a lot of the other things that we're going to talk about is also the cyber attack that happened in May last year as well. But then before we get to that part, like,
Yeah,
how would you describe Health Service Executive as an organization today, just to give some context to the ones that are tuning in?
it's so the health service. It's the single biggest organization in the country. I think you described it as one of the biggest healthcare systems in the world. I
Mhm.
don't like we're a small country. We're 5 million people. We're kind of like you
Yeah.
guys in Norway.
Hmm.
So we're small, but like in terms of relative scale.
Yeah.
So the HSE provides. So it's both healthcare prevention, it's the healthcare delivery side of it, it's community, it's in hospitals. So it's throughout the full healthcare system, and the full suite of things that you would have within healthcare is delivered by the health service. And then it's in combination with there are private hospitals, there are voluntary hospitals. So we've got a mixed kind of model in terms of how we deliver care in the country. It's 150,000 people. It's HSE in its current incarnation has been around since 2005. And
Mhm.
before that, we had 9 health boards that turned into one big organization. And again, the organization design side of it becomes in, like, it's how do you conceive and think of these things as they go from 9 things into one thing. And now we're going to 6 areas as part of a new strategy to move to a regional model of healthcare service, which is kind of a geographic based model around that. And all of these things kind of become relevant in terms of how it works. And over time, like healthcare, I hadn't spent, up until probably 5 years ago, I hadn't done very much in healthcare. I dabbled,
Mhm.
I'd been on the edges, I'd been in and out. And then 3 years ago when I started, it's a shock to the system, because you realize that actually as an industry, a lot of the things that are, I guess, things move at a different speed. So because it's to do with people's lives and health and things like that, there's kind of a different shape to the curve of change inside of the organization, particularly from a technology perspective. And so if you're a software vendor working in the healthcare space, the products you sell are very sticky. So we've got lots of old things. And old isn't bad, right? So old's just old. Old and
Mhm.
fragile is bad, but old is just old. So we're
Yeah.
kind of, at one level we've got a lot of different things, and it's grown up. And because we had 9 different organizations that merged into one, there were lots of different
Mhm.
strategies in terms of what we would buy and where it would fit and how do we go. And then through the years it's kind of coalesced into broad themes around it, but there's lots and lots and lots of stuff and lots of activity and lots of people doing things, and it's all trying to keep the show on the road in terms of delivering healthcare services. And most healthcare systems are under pressure, and so we're trying to keep the show on the road, and at the same time you're trying to improve and change. And it's a big ask, right? So there's an awful lot of work to do, and trying to coordinate change inside of an organization like that and bring people with you, that's a big problem. Like, it's an ongoing big problem.
And then, like, if you look at this, because we started to working together last year as well, right? Ardoq and Health Service Executive, and I remember that when we were in the middle of that validation process as well, which was in May, you have this kind of double trouble in itself, right? Because you have the pandemic, which is, of course, turned everything upside down in general. But then you also had a cyber attack, which was one of the biggest in the last 15 years. So, can you describe, what happens when you're attacked by a cyber attack, and especially at an organization that has 100,000 plus employees as well? Like, what happens in an organization like that?
So actually, let's go back to the pandemic first, because I think that's
Yep.
an interesting piece too. So pandemic happens. You've got 150,000 employees. Some of them are in locations where they have to go to work because they're delivering healthcare services directly to patients. So then you've got to figure out, and this is on the ground. So some of it's technology based, some of it isn't. But how do you organize and change the way you work? This was around, like, literally hospitals were splitting themselves in two to say, this is the COVID bit, this is the non-COVID bit, if you go back 2 years ago. And actually the COVID piece that was, so I ended up working on our digital contact tracing solution in Ireland. So I was the lead on that, which started 2 years ago today. So there was a meeting on Paddy's Day, and then I got a phone call tomorrow 2 years ago to say, hey, your life is about to be turned upside down. But we went through that process. We moved 40,000 people home to work from home, right? So how do you move 40,000 people home? And then you realize it's like, well, what services do I need to provide them? How do I support them? How are they going to talk to each other? Do people understand how to work from home? So we're used to it, because I've been working, I don't know about you, but I've been working from home on and off for 10, 15 years. So it's kind of normal and natural, and I've got an office and that's all fine. But when you're moving people who've been in an office environment home, and one of my colleagues, Maria, she'd been involved in that side of it. And it's a scary scale when you're moving 40,000 people home to different places. And some of them aren't set up to do it. So how do you do that? So we had lots of changes like that working our way through during COVID. There's probably been more work in terms of more real tangible change and material pieces in terms of new things brought to life. Then just really quickly, so contact tracing systems, vaccination systems, like all of these things were kind of put together, like big analytics platforms. They were all brought together and done. And a lot of them were kind of multi-agency, multi-party. So it wasn't HSE, it was HSE, Department of Health, other government departments, the police, the defence forces. So we were all collaborating together in a very loose and free way. And then we started, or the conversation with you guys had started around how do we make sense in a very complex strategic environment of what's going on. So we've got a national strategy for healthcare in Ireland called Sláinte Care, and Sláinte means health, right? So in Irish. So we're trying to make sense of, we've got these goals and actions, and how do they tie to what we're doing, and how do we make sense of the work that we're doing in the context of the stuff that we said we're going to do at a national level. So we're trying to draw lines around that just to figure it out so we can tell that story better, right? And again, it's around the telling of the story and the joining of the dots between things. So we can have a narrative piece to it where we're telling it all the time, but ultimately we ended up with a bunch of PDFs, PowerPoint documents, all with like bullet points inside of it that meant something, but didn't really have a life outside of that. We couldn't connect it. So that was the original conversation. And then in May, so we had a ransomware attack. So Conti hit that group, and it's hard to explain what happened, because basically on the Friday it hit, and then we literally switched off everything. Right. So if you imagine an organization that's covering health in Ireland, so every hospital, anything that was connected to the National Health Network was switched off and powered down. Right. And it was like, boom, all connections in and out, everything went dark, Stone Age.
That's insane.
That's basically what happened. And at that point, you realize, then the question is, where do you start? Right. And I think one of the benefits, and so the CIO, who has been working in this organization for a long time and has an awful lot of history, so gets it, right? So really like the depth of it and gets it. And there's a lot of people working in the organization with the history of it, and I think you need that, right? So you need that kind of that deep knowledge of how things work and how things are connected and what needs to happen, and have also gone through nothing at the scale of this, but gone through crises like this before in terms of how you address and deal with that. But one of the things with this one in particular was you realized what you didn't know. You found that out in a hurry, right? So you're finding out that you're saying, well, what do we need to recover? It's like everything. In what order? What's the most important thing? Where are the dependencies? So a lot
Yeah.
of the work that we were doing during that period was trying to figure out the dependencies between things, trying to figure out like what it was, where it was, like all of these kind of things, which we knew, but we didn't know in a way that was going to help us in a situation like that. And I think that's the key bit, because and actually, if you look at architecture in general as an exercise in knowledge management, that's kind of where we've ended up, that it becomes a knowledge management exercise of codifying the things we should know and making sure they're available when we need to know them, and available to in the right way, because it's all well and good. It's, oh, I have it in a document or it's on a wiki. It's like, can
Yeah.
I actually answer the question that I need to answer, which is, who do I call right now because this has happened, right? And who do I
Yeah.
call next after that? And how do I structure around that? So a lot of the work that's going on now is we've had a post cyber kind of an after action review on and there's a lot of kind of cleanup and exercises around that, and I'm involved in some of them. But
Yeah.
it really it brings to bear just the, particularly in a large kind of entangled complex organization where people have built processes and built, I guess, work activities around systems in a way that maybe the people who built them or deployed them didn't really understand. Because
Yeah.
that is what happens. It's like humans and technology kind of over time, they develop these ways of interacting, and you get these kind of emergent qualities from how they're working together. And that's a big challenge
Exactly.
for us.
Yeah, exactly. I just saw that there is some cracking noise in the microphone as well. So I don't know if you can just change. I don't know where the microphone is coming from. I don't know if that's possible. Just I can hear it sometimes, but I think it should work. But yeah, just kind of while you're checking that, Gar, as well, I think this is one of the things, like when we were working together, right? Where suddenly it's just changed our scope of what we were doing, and understanding the cyber and the level as well. And I think this has been one of the biggest kind of challenges that a lot of organizations are facing as well. Just as you said, like, who do I contact right now if this were to happen? Like, where is the impact? And that is something that, of course, we're helping organizations with as well, to kind of better understand that impact. But looking at it in kind of in the rearview mirror now, like, where does an organization go after this? Like, what are some of the key things that you guys have taken away from this? I guess it's a lot, but what are some of the key things?
Yeah, I guess like one of the things is just due to the complexity and the way the organization has evolved, then you've got to figure out like a lot of the traditional ways of dealing with these things have been flat. Are you still getting a crackle, or is it okay?
We still hear a little bit of a crack.
Okay, we'll, we'll
Technology,
figure that out.
folks.
Yes,
That's
technology.
uh,
Uh,
that's how it is.
give me one. So let me try the.
Is that any better?
Now we can hear you without the cracking noise, at least. Can you hear us?
Okay. Yes.
Yep.
Yes. So I've changed mics. So
Yep.
in terms of what we took away, I mean, like one of the things was that the our view on how we would collect and capture and manage information didn't reflect the complexity of the model that we needed, and it's really because we've got these. It's like a fractal structure, right? So we're at a top level, and then it replicates as you go to region, then it replicates again, and it replicates again, and to try and capture that in a spreadsheet, which is kind of the traditional conventional way of doing these things, is pretty hard, right?
Yep.
And that was kind of the bit around it. And even with the benefit of hindsight, I think we've gone through probably 6 or 7 iterations of what the model looks like and how we're going to organize this information. And it started off with how we're going to organize it to store it, and then it's how we're going to organize it to make it useful and to be able to
Exactly.
answer what we need to answer. And then also, how do we stop this falling out of date? How do we bake this and weave this into the processes so this just keeps up to date, right, all of the time? And it's independent of the tooling you use. It's more conceptually, how are you thinking about
Yes.
weaving it into the process, and it can't be a separate process, right? And I think one of the things that like over the years with architecture teams is the idea of an architecture process. An architecture process independent of what other people are doing is pointless. They're not going to come to
I
you for
totally
this,
agree.
right?
Yeah.
You got to you got to figure out where you live, right? You got to figure out where the
Mhm.
touch points are, how you inject yourself into that, and how you get this, because ultimately this is to everybody's benefit. And going to where people are, meeting where they are, and actually going through that process, that's the critical piece in this in terms of getting these things moving. Otherwise, it'll be like, I think the fear out of these things, and I've experienced this personally in other organizations, is you do it, it's done, it's forgotten, and then something else happens. It's never really
Exactly.
baked, it's never really adopted, and you just get
Mm.
it can be quite soul destroying, right, when you see that
Yeah.
happening. And I guess
Yeah.
one of the things with the stuff we're doing at the moment is just making sure this sticks, right? Because
Mhm.
we've actually seen this happen. We've seen two things that would never happen: a pandemic and a major cyber event, both
Exactly.
happen in one time frame, and there's nothing to
It's
say it won't happen again.
exactly, and I think that story as well, I think, should also be kind of a reminder as well about the importance of actually, documenting your current state as well. And there's a lot of, especially the kind of C level executives that we're talking with. They're often saying that, but we have a control over our landscape, and then, okay, do you know what will happen if kind of one of your servers goes down, for example? It's about actually having that visibility into the landscape, and then also look at the impact when something changes. And as you said, like, if this is a process that is run in parallel, we have the architecture function doing the documentation in parallel with what's actually going on in the business. Like, it's not going to stay up to date. So I think this should also be a reminder of the importance of having an architecture function, if you will, or an architecture capability in place. If it's done in the right way, if it's focused on the kind of the business outcomes, the customer services, and not the frameworks and notations in itself as well.
Yeah, it's and I always struggle. It's funny because as soon as you say function, I can feel myself go right, because and I've been through this as part of the work I was doing with IVI. We'd come across organizations that had functionalized this thing. This is pervasive. You need to put the architects where the action is, right? They need to be
Mhm.
embedded. They need to be on the ground. They need to have skin in the game. They can't be
Yeah,
observers. They can't be passengers. They can't be blue helmet UN guys who are kind of thrown in there to peacekeepers. Like,
yeah.
you've got to have skin in the game here, and you also have to
How
be
do you get them
responsible
in the
for
game?
this. I think this ends up being a team design and an organization design problem. It's like, how are you
Yeah.
organizing yourself to do the activities that you're doing? And again, so we've gone through bits where, like, originally, and I think this is kind of a wave in the industry. So everybody organized around projects. So we're going to do projects. We're going to do projects better. And then you realize, well, so I deliver a project. Now what happens? Well, it's got a life. It's like, okay, so now what do we do? We'll do service management after we do that. Okay, so then we move to product management. We're going to do product management. Then we're going to do
The
agile
next
product
level. Yeah.
management. It's like, and we keep
Mhm.
kicking this ball down the road, but I think a lot of the issues stem from, we need people who actually understand this. Like, I look at, it was funny, we were reflecting on kind of 2 years of, so we built an app in 100 days, right? And from start to finish, we built it 3 times, right? You could look at it and say, so somebody could come after the fact and say, oh, you were agile, right? So we weren't agile,
Mhm.
right? We were something other than agile. And
Yeah.
it like, if you look at the practices and everything else, if you look at kind of the rituals and those kind of things, we didn't do any of them. We talked. Everybody talked,
Mhm.
and everybody knew
Yeah.
what their job was. And we didn't go through protracted planning exercises. We didn't do anything like that. But everybody talked, and everybody knew what their job was. And I think
Yeah.
improving the quality of the people doing the job is the most important thing that's on the table for us right now. We need
Mhm.
people who are going to develop these skills, and we need to grow people into that. And then we can figure out, and then you put somebody into deliver something, then they know how to do it. I think that's
Yeah.
like one of the reflections that, like, we've had on it, is that as you look at the governance structures that we've invented or implemented, a lot of them are overcorrections to do with error, right? So we've implemented governance structures to protect us from somebody doing something and screwing something up. And really, like, so if you know what your job is, and you know how to do it, and you know how to make good decisions, and you know how to do it in a way that's collaborative and communicate that, then the governance structures, it's not that they don't apply to you, but you've embedded that knowledge, right? So you've
Yeah.
synthesized that piece and you move past it. I think all of the rest of it and all of the theatre around governance and all the theatre around architecture has been to prevent people who don't know what they're doing from doing stupid things, right? That's the reality of it,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
But we've created an industry of doing that instead of actually focusing on the problem, which is how do we help these people get better, which is not
yeah.
about policing them. It's actually
No,
about, it's a skills acquisition, skills development, experience development
exactly,
piece. That's the key,
exactly.
right? To
Yeah.
me, that's the key.
Exactly, and this really resonates. And I know, one of the things I wanted to ask you about as well, because I know you had, there's also role models throughout your career, but then also kind of resources that you have read and indulged over the years, which I think has been quite valuable. And one of the things that I know, the books that you have been reading as well, is just a 60 page book, but it's really good, right? And that's also the bullshit, there, because I think a lot of this is also to do
Yeah.
with bullshit, making things complex when it actually could be very easy if you just communicate transparently. Can you just, try to summarize that book? Why is that book so important and more important than ever before?
So this is one of those weird ones. So there's a guy called Jim Rutt who has a podcast, and we can share a link afterwards. But
Yeah, we share that, please.
he was in conversation about this book called On Bullshit, which was written in 2006 by a philosopher, right? So by Harry Frankfurt. And he was trying to define what bullshit was. And he was also saying that this is the age of bullshit, right? And so bullshit aren't outright lies, right? So, but bullshit is something. So I can bullshit myself, but I can't lie to myself. So I can't accept an untruth that I know to be factually untrue, right? But I can bullshit myself. So I can choose to believe these things and I can feed myself with this information, and I can live inside these bubbles to do that. And if you think about how we've constructed the kind of the narratives and the memes that propagate through the industry and the waves that go through, and we're like, I mean, we're just, so I've got the ape on the front here, right? It's echoes of savages, but
Yeah,
we're basically we're higher primates. That's it, right? So we mimic each other all of the time. So we see what somebody else does, and we just do more of that. And I
exactly.
think one of the bits in this, and one of the things that he touches on, is that this is a self-fulfilling cycle of bullshit that we just keep going through. And
Yeah.
you have to have an interrupt in there, or you've got to at least acknowledge and understand the system that you've created and that you live inside of. So he tries to get to like a philosophical definition of what is bullshit, how is it different from lying, what it is, where it
Mhm.
exists, how it's existed in history, what other forms it had. So it's 60 pages, but so then I decided I was going to run an experiment. So I bought 3 more copies of the books, and I gave it to 3 people with an annotation, and I want them back in 12 months. So
Yeah.
Tim, Maria, Orla, I want my books back in 12 months. You've got to
So
they've got to read it and give it to somebody else, and we'll see where it goes. Because I'm
is
curious to
there
see, who would you give a book like that to?
yeah, is there a reason why you gave it to them? Is there something you want to explain while we're live?
It just, yeah. So they're all Orla's my wife, right? So I
Yeah.
give it to her.
Stop with this bullshit.
Yeah, stop with this bullshit. And she's had to listen to me talk about this stuff for a long time. And then
Yeah.
Tim Willoughby is a close friend of mine, and we've worked very closely together, and he gets it. And so
Mhm.
we've got a similar sense of humor. And Maria's a colleague of mine in the HSC. We've
Yeah.
also got a similar sense of humor, and we're kind of playing in the same space. So I just thought it was an interesting
Yeah.
starting point, and it was sending it into 3 different networks in
Mhm.
different directions. So we'll see what
Yeah.
happens, right?
I,
Nothing
I
might
look
happen,
forward.
something might
I look
happen.
forward to that, to hearing about what they say, especially your wife as well. Maybe she gives you a copy of a book as well.
The annotation
But
might be interesting.
yeah, yeah. But the last thing that I wanted to ask, I know there's a couple of other resources that you wanted
Yeah.
to share as well, but we will also publish this and share this afterwards. But sitting down today, like, what are some of the key takeaways, from your career? If you met Gar, 25 years old, living his life, uh, kind of what advice would you give him based on what you know now? Follow
Yeah,
Bill
I
Gates.
mean, it's it's funny because I like a couple of things come up straight away. Like I'm always curious about things, so just stay curious. Like, I mean, constantly be curious about things, be questioning things, be asking about it. Try and get underneath the hood of some of these things and try and understand why they work and how they work. So what are the mechanisms? So I was kicking the tires on a PhD with a friend of mine, Paddy O'Reilly, just before COVID, and like a lot of the work there was trying to figure out, it's like, how are we thinking about these things, and what are the frameworks that we use, and what are the lenses we can apply to it. And I think that's a really valuable exercise in terms of just capturing the stuff that you're doing, and actually collecting it, right? So get a journal, just write stuff down, collect those
Mhm.
memories, and do it in different ways. So that's one. I think another one that served me very well is that I got really interested in visual thinking, right, as a different way of kind of capturing and storing and managing information.
Yeah.
And and actually, you'll see in the resources some of it. So if you take Sandtalk or knowledge assets, they're all in the areas of knowledge management. So one's indigenous tribal systems for knowledge management, and the other is kind of more formal ways of doing knowledge management. But I'm curious about that. But the ability to draw things introduces a different way for you to think about it. So if you can visualize it, it also changes the way you have a conversation about it because it's ambiguous. And if you're not
Mm.
clear, you can point to the picture and ask. You can't point to the thought that's in my head. So in the middle of a conversation, if we're talking about something and we get stuck, there's nothing to work with, right? So you're trying to read my mind, I'm trying to read your mind.
Yeah.
I think that's a key bit. I think the other bit that falls out of that is on the kind of behavioral psychology side of it. It's understanding how humans work, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately this ends up being how do humans work, and how are we going to work together? And like I've got this on my desk all the time, which you can't see. So it's called
Yeah.
so it's a sorry, I will take this off. This is a quick promo for Charlie Davies. Very clear ideas.
Oh, nice.
So it's a way of getting clear on things,
Yeah.
but with people. So Charlie's
Hmm.
job is to make everybody as clear as they can be, and
Yeah.
he's built tools to help you get clear. And I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of stuff that we have kind of focused on up and to the left into that hyper rational view of the world, and there's a lot of pieces where we kind of need to get in touch with, particularly on the human side of it, how do
Exactly.
we have better quality conversations? How do we get clear? And how do we reveal some of the embodied knowledge that's kind of there as well? Because
Yeah.
it's a tricky stuff, and it's not. I'm not on the woo woo end of it, but it's more that there is like you're
Yeah, but it
this. It's
makes,
not
yeah,
just the stuff that's in your prefrontal
mm,
neocortex. It's the rest of it makes your
exactly.
body plays a bigger part in this as well. So
Yeah,
yeah, so
that
that
makes a, mm. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that just wanted to mention that as well, because that makes a lot of sense, and I think a lot of, especially the ones coming from the IT function as well, looking to kind of try to bridge the gap between business and IT and try to get the attention from the business stakeholders, is also to kind of understand the human psychology, and I think it can come a long way when also learning how to sell, for example, learning how to communicate, learning how to ask the right questions, and just as you said, like having proper conversations, which is going to help both IT and business. So
yeah.
I think this really is a good
I'll give
summary.
you two last ones, Henrik, as well. So
Yeah.
like do stuff that scares the shit out of you, right?
Mhm.
So if you're like, and I'm talking from a well, actually in all aspects of your life, but actually just take risks and take chances on those things and actually go and do them
YOLO.
because you can't do
Yes.
it otherwise.
Yeah.
I think the other one is that, and one of the resources there is from. So there's a guy called Dave Snowden who's been quite influential in my thinking, and he has he basically he's working in the area of complexity and sense making, and actually getting to grips with that and understanding the domains you're working in. And because we use the words complex, we use the words simple and complicated and clear all the time, but without really good definitions and without tools to help us understand where are we right now, right?
Mhm.
Are we in a complex situation? Are we confused? If we're confused, then where do we go from here, and what actions do I take? And I think the right action, making sense, is the first step that leads to better choices, right? So
Mhm.
then my choice making gets better if I can make sense of where I'm at, because I understand the constraints and where I'm at today. And I think that was one of that has been really one of the pivotal pieces for me, is as I got my head around some of the stuff that Dave is talking about, I was like, oh wow, okay, right. And it opens up the world in a very different way as you begin to look at it that way through that
Yeah.
lens.
Makes a lot of sense, and we're going to share those resources afterwards for everyone curious to learn more about them. Gar, it's been great to have you on the show today. I know that this will not be the last conversation that we have. I've truly enjoyed our conversations over the last 2 years, and I think as we said before we went live here as well, like you can do serious things, but you can have fun while you're doing it. And I'm it's safe to say that I'm having a good time when we're working together. So this has been great.
And me,
And for
Henrik,
the
thank you.
awesome. And for the ones that has been watching today and tuning into Behind the Future, we will be coming with new episodes in April as well. And for the ones that haven't seen it, we just got the latest funding round of $125 million. So I know that this is not going to be the final Behind the Future episode. So tune in for more going forward. And as always, Gar, it's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks, Henrik.
See you on the other side.
Take care. Thanks,
Bye.
guys.